plug that into our because we're going to die otherwise over an hour. Yeah.
There it goes.
I have here.
Done.
Okay. No. Welcome. Today we are honored to introduce Nicco Mele. As you see and watch on website Boston Global Forum already. Yeah. He is not only a strategist and a visionary people and podcasters in internet technology politics, but also writing. He is also he is a poet.
Oh, yes.
We are honored to introduce you with introduce Nicco Mele with you.
Thank you.
Present.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here on the Boston Globe Forum.
Yep.
Hello to all those viewers out there.
Now you talk first.
Oh, I talk
Yeah,
first.
you're free to give us an overview of your book.
So I'm the recent author of a book called The End of Big, which surely I have a copy of right here. The End of Big from St. Martin's Press was out this past spring. My thesis is that technology radically pushes power to individuals out of institutions. That our technology has a really powerful effect on our technology really is empowering individuals at an unprecedented rate, in an unprecedented way, and that has a dramatic impact on institutions. All of the institutions of the modern era were designed in a time, in many cases, before electricity existed, and certainly well before the advent of the smartphone. And so all of our big things, everything from big news to big political parties, big government, big militaries, big universities, big manufacturing, big movie companies, all of them really aren't prepared for the modern era, can't figure out how to navigate it. That's my summary. Get us started. Is that a good one?
Yeah, that's a good one. Excellent.
Are we on, Wayne?
Yeah, so I figured since we have a pretty global audience, we might want to start with a little bit about your background and what your story is. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And sort of what shaped who you are today?
Sure. I was born in West Africa, in Kumasi, Ghana. And my father was in the U.S. State Department, and I grew up in U.S. embassies, mostly in Indonesia and South Korea and Malaysia. And I graduated when I was 18 from high school in Malaysia and moved to the United States to go to university at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia.
So what were your interests growing up? How did you get involved in the technology side and the politics side?
I was always interested in technology. I just am a tinkerer by nature, you might say, like building things and taking things apart. But the kicker for me was, here I am, I'm a U.S. Embassy kid, I'm supposed to be an American. But I haven't really lived in the United States. I don't really know very much about it in some ways. And so I thought, well, my father loved baseball, Americans love baseball, I really got into baseball. But you know, in the pre-internet days, to get baseball scores when you're living in Malaysia, it can be really pretty challenging. It's not like it's not like you can go online and check what the scores in last night's game were.
Yeah.
You literally had to wait for a boat to come across the Pacific with news of the latest baseball scores. And I heard there was this thing called the internet where you could get baseball scores right away. And it was actually prior, really, is before the invention of the World Wide Web, before Mosaic. The very early days, and that got me involved. I talk about this a little bit in the book. That got me involved in the old school, they call them BBSs, bulletin board systems, which in the early days of connectivity were kind of like localized internets, you might say. Just a handful of homes involved.
And what about the interest in politics? How did that come about?
how did that come about? Well, politics is power. You want to change things, you have to speak the language of politics.
Yeah. And so your first real political involvement was on the Howard Dean campaign in 2004.
Well, it goes back a little far than that. When I was the college I went to was a couple of hours from Washington D.C.
Yeah.
And in the summers I worked in Washington D.C. I worked fixing computers. In Washington D.C. because my parents had moved back there, and also because it was the nearest city to my college. And Washington D.C. is a political place. You can't live there. Even though I was fixing computers and setting up printers and fixing paper jams and all the IT things, making sure phones worked, that was still in D.C. in the heart of politics. And I got very interested in politics, and I worked at a bunch of places, but most especially a place called Common Cause. Common Cause is a campaign finance reform group, a watchdog group.
Mm-hmm.
And it got me that was at the time, it was right around the time John McCain was running for president the first time, and he made campaign finance reform his issue. And when he lost in the primary to George W. Bush, he got very serious about running a political campaign, a legislative campaign to pass significant campaign finance reform. It's called the McCain-Feingold bill to this day, the soft money ban. And so that was intoxicating to be that close to politics at Common Cause. And that was shortly thereafter we had Bush v. Gore in the Supreme Court, and that was I don't know, that was disenchanting, demoralizing in some way. And I ended up leaving politics, moved to New York City, and was working in New York and heard a guy give a speech in a bar.
Yeah.
And moved to Vermont to work for Howard Dean.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. That doesn't happen that often. We have that combination of being in the right place at the right time, with a background not having grown up in the United States.
It was just everything just found the place just right.
Yeah.
But I didn't know it at the time. Only in retrospect is that clear.
It is interesting reading your book to acknowledge that for the first 18 years of your life, you didn't live in the United States, and like you said, you didn't know much about it other than.
Well, as a U.S. citizen, I spent summers visiting family here. I mean, I wasn't like I was totally without it, but and I grew up in to be a part of the U.S. Embassy is to be in politics. I mean, diplomacy is politics. So I was very conscious of being an American U.S. citizen. Always very conscious of U.S. politics because they affected our diplomacy.
Yeah.
I was very much a Cold War kid. I mean, I mostly grew up in U.S. embassies when Reagan was president.
Yeah. And so you go up to Vermont, you join Howard Dean's campaign on the fundraising side.
Well, I joined the campaign to do all things internet related, help with the website, help with emails, and we really didn't have social media in those days, but to the extent there was anything like social media, anything digital, and the campaign the website became the major vehicle for the campaign, So that was definitely the challenge of the thing.
Troubleshooting some technical issues. And a little lag.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, good.
So for a global audience, we're live streaming this in Vietnam. Can you talk a little bit about the Howard Dean campaign? What was different about that campaign?
So that's a good question. In the United States, every 4 years we have a presidential election, and there are two parties, and each party has its own primary election where the members of the party duke it out, and one nominee, one presidential candidate emerges.
Mm-hmm.
In 2003, the presidential election was in 2004, and the Republicans had their candidate, the president, George W. Bush. But the Democrats did not have their candidate, and there was what they call an open primary, a primary election that had a whole bunch of Democrats running for president in the primaries. And the way the primary system works, in a presidential, everybody votes on one day, right? First Tuesday in November, Tuesday. And in the primaries, every state votes, and it's like a slow march, a slow accumulation of state after state after state after state. And the first two states are Iowa and New Hampshire. And in 2003, there were, I think, 9 total presidential candidates. Oh, this is good. Let me see if I can name them after 10 years. John Kerry, who ended up the eventual nominee. John Kerry is a U.S. Senator, a long history in American politics. Dick Gephardt. Dick Gephardt had been the minority Speaker of the House Minority Leader in the Congress. He's a very long-time Democrat. Joe Lieberman, who had been famously, Joe Lieberman is a U.S. Senator who had famously been Al Gore's vice presidential candidate. General Wesley Clark, who was a very high-ranking Army general who had left the Army to run for president. Kara Mosley Braun, who'd been a U.S. Senator from Illinois, African-American woman. Reverend Al Sharpton, a perennial favorite. Dennis Kucinich, a U.S. congressman who's very far to the left. It's only 7. There's Howard Dean, who's governor of Vermont. That's 8. But I think I'm missing one. Anyway, I'll come back to that.
Sorry, I can't help with that, unfortunately.
And so it was a very crowded field. Everybody's trying to run for president, and the election was the I don't remember the exact date, but the Iowa caucus was the first or second week of January. It was very early January 2004. And so this was in early 2003. There were that many declared candidates. And so it's, 6 months, 9 months before the election, people can't tell who's winning because there's been no votes. And so there's something called the money primary. And the way that works is the person who's raising the most money is generally considered the front runner. And the fundraising is disclosed quarterly. So April 1st, July 1st, October 1st, January 1st, right? The end of each quarter, the next day, you disclose how much money you raised. And it was kind of well established that John Kerry was the front runner. He was raising the most money. I think he was raising $5 or $6 million in the quarter. And it was also that everyone would keep their number secret until the last day, right? To surprise everybody. And Howard Dean, I don't remember what his first quarter numbers were, but it was the ratio was something like Kerry raising $5 million, Howard Dean raising 70 grand, and everybody else in between. It's actually kind of like a linear slope of sorts, and at the very end is Howard Dean. But something incredible happened, which is in Q2, in April, May, and June, Dean built a giant online movement and raised not 5, not 6, not 7 million, but almost $15 million. He set a record. Set a record for primary fundraising, and it was a shock. No one saw it coming. The reason it was a shock is that in American politics, Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. Money's really traditionally been raised 2 ways. One way is you get a list of rich people, and you call them up, and you ask them for money. Right? And you ask them, in U.S. law, the maximum a single person can give to a candidate in an election is, was it $2,100, $2,200, something like that? A little over $2,000. And so how many rich people do you know who can write a $2,000 check? That's pretty much the game. Mm-hmm. The other way you raise money is you build a big list of people who can give $25 each, and you send them letters in the mail, ask them to give to your campaign. It's called direct mail. But direct mail is expensive because you have to buy postage. If average gift is like $25 or $30, and you're gonna give, you're gonna give them to raise $1 million in $25 or $50 chunks. You have to send a lot of mail, and each piece of mail you have to buy the postage on. You have to buy a stamp, right? So it's kind of a lunatic. Yeah. It's just a lunatic situation all around. Either you have to know a lot of rich people and call them up to raise money, or you have to spend a lot of money to build a direct mail operation. And that people do that, but that takes time. That takes years, decades even. And so the internet opened up a third new way of raising money. where you didn't have to know a lot of rich people, and you didn't have to spend a lot of time building a big direct mail list and spend a lot of money on sending people mail. You could have a clear, compelling, coherent message, send an email, which cost almost nothing, and people would donate online using their credit cards. And it was at the time a real thunderclap in American politics. It was a real change because you didn't have to be a part of the establishment to raise money. If you look at American politics, in that election I just said, almost all of those people were from Washington, D.C. They lived and worked in Washington, D.C. The Howard Dean campaign was the only presidential campaign that did not have a headquarters in Washington, D.C. And so it was the first time someone from outside the establishment won the money primary, had enough money to be financially competitive. And that was that was a big deal. And of course, Dean lost in the end. But 4 years later, another guy from seriously outside the establishment used the internet to raise money to break all of the barriers the establishment had put up, and defeated Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. And at the time, it was unthinkable. In 2007, the Democratic Party was the party that Bill and Hillary Clinton built. It was their party. They even built like the building in Washington, D.C. It was like the Bill and Hillary Clinton party. And so to lose to a man who'd been in public life less than a decade was a shock. It was just a tremendous shock. And that was made possible because the internet made Obama financially competitive. And that's actually kind of the thesis of my book. Part of my book started with, well, if I was Hillary, what would I have done? How would an establishment person, an establishment product, an establishment character, if you hold all of the keys to power, then how would you use the internet? Is it very clear how outsiders and insurgents can use the internet to challenge the establishment, to disrupt? Everyone talks about the internet as a disruptive force. Very clear how you can use it to be disruptive. What's not clear is how you might use it if you're in charge, right? And that's the hard work we have to do. That's the work of the future. That's the work I started to chip away at with my book.
So with that revolution or disruption that the internet fundraising brought in the 2004 campaign, how has that evolved in the last couple of presidential elections? Would you say that sort of reached like a maturity level, or is it still something in its infancy that in upcoming elections might surprise us again?
Well, what I would say is that that's a hard one. I think there's plenty of surprises ahead, but ultimately, Obama raised something like $500 million on the internet and spent almost every dime buying television ads. And so the internet has significantly changed the fundraising in politics. Asterisks, mostly at the federal level, presidential level. I should say federal, mostly at the national level, not in like the mayoral or the member of Congress. But at a national level, the internet's really changed the fundraising game. And then outside of fundraising, it's hard to really quantify the impact of the internet. Definitely changed the nature of managing the press, dealing with the press. There's a famous, they say the boys on the bus. There's a bus that follows the presidential candidates around. It's full of journalists. And the internet, especially Twitter, has really changed that equation significantly. David Axelrod said Twitter was more important to the 2012 presidential campaign in the New York Times. And so there is a way you use the technology to manage social media. There is a way you use the social media to manage the press to change the narrative of stories. But one of the core parts of running for office is persuading people to vote for you, or persuading people not to vote for your opponent. And a lot of that's still done through very traditional advertising channels. And it's not clear when or if that will change.
So how do you think, with the revolution again brought about by the internet and by social media especially, how do you think that might affect future elections in terms of defeating the establishment, which is sort of that big institution that you predict is declining?
I think it's very hard I think it's too early to say how history will judge Barack Obama's presidency. Right now, it's not being judged very well, and I think part of that is because part of that speaks to the challenges of running as an insurgent and governing as the establishment. Right? And so that's just a core challenge. I remember when Obama was first elected, there was this story in the New York Times. He wasn't president yet; he was president-elect. There was a story in the New York Times about how they didn't want him to have his own email address or his own BlackBerry. And it was like, and he had to like fight to get his own phone, like the president of the United States. And that's because the pace and direction of the institution is out of sync with the technology, sometimes quite purposefully, sometimes for good reason. I think if you look outside the U.S. at the way the technology is used by activists to challenge establishment power, it's different, but you see a similar challenge, right? Like look at what's happened with the Arab Spring, and you use the technology to challenge the establishment, but then governing turns out is hard. The nature of institutions is can be a real challenge, right? It's easy to disrupt. It's harder to build and manage and grow.
Yeah. You mentioned a few examples in your book about how the end of big, for example, with the example of the playground where your children play, where the government wasn't going to replace the slide, and neighbors that used the slide regularly did a fundraising campaign to replace it. Another example that you mentioned was the road in Hawaii that was too expensive for the government to fix, and citizens took the initiative upon themselves to fix it. Now, how scalable do you see this?
I don't actually think it's that scalable. That's part of the challenge, right? That I'm a nerd. I love the internet. I love technology, but I also think that this is we don't really understand how to use these things inside of existing institutions for the best outcomes. Right, the story on the slide on my head was a very big playground slide in my neighborhood, and a hurricane came along and destroyed it. And the town said it was going to be a few years and a whole bunch of money to have it rebuilt. And so some parents started a PayPal page and put up signs around the neighborhood of the park, printed them out on their printer, and said, "Hey, come, if everybody who visits the park gives $50, we'll have the money to rebuild the slides in no time." And sure enough, that's what happened. But that creates all kinds of challenges for setting priorities. What if there was a sewage problem in the neighborhood, and the goal of the local government was to actually fix the sewage problem before they fix the slides?
Yeah.
Then you don't really want the citizens going around raising money for slides, right? On the other hand, that's a kind of civic participation I applaud. I want people to be that engaged in their local government. The trick is that their local government frequently doesn't have the vehicles, the ways to participate in that same way.
Yeah, yeah, because if you read what economists are saying to fix America, you often hear that infrastructure is pretty high up on their list of to do, at least on one side of the spectrum. But then again, you run into these hurdles where you can't really address those needs, and so you don't think that we're anywhere near a situation where people could take that civic drive to the next level and address some of those.
Oh, I want to channel people's civic energy into things, into their government. I want people's energy to go into their government. That's important. That's what de Tocqueville loved about the United States, is that when you had a meeting, everybody showed up, not just the crazy people, right? And so that's what I want. I want our best effort, our best energy, our best time, our best attention to go into our communities, to go into our government. But that's not happening right now. And part of the reason that's not happening is the government doesn't provide ways for that to happen, right? And sometimes it can be really hard to figure out when the next city council meeting is going to be. Like sometimes government's just hard to figure out. Other times it's completely inaccessible. And in an age when people use their phones to transact all kinds of businesses, there's this expectation of ease of use, of directness. And government has to get closer to that. It doesn't have to be that. because there's reasons you might not want it to do that. But I would say the gap between our institutions and our government and our technology in our lives is growing. Our technology is headed off in this direction at an incredible speed and excitement, all kinds of things happening. But our government, our policies, our institutions, our approaches, our processes are like going in a different direction.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous gap for all of us.
How do we fill it?
That's up to you. No, that's the challenge of the next 100 years, the United States. Is how do we bridge that gap between the tremendous connective power of our technology and the realities of governing and decision making and priority setting in communities.
Yeah. I want to bring in some questions from the audience that we received beforehand. There's the CEO of Evernet who has a technical question for you, which is, what do you think about the Federal Communications Commission net neutrality rules? If you're familiar with it.
There was a decision yesterday, maybe it was Monday, I can't remember exactly, it's all a little muddy, but what do I think about that? Well, I think it's really essential that our technology infrastructure maintain a neutrality. I don't want Comcast or a cable provider to say, well, we'll make the New York Times load a little slower until they pay us a fee. We'll make it a little harder to get to a news source that doesn't pay us a fee. Because that can be a slippery slope to all kinds of gateways, right? And so on the one hand, I think that the infrastructure for delivery of the internet, of our media, needs to have a neutrality to it. Should not carry different kinds of financial or ideological penalties or incentives. By the same token, I do think there is, at the root of this is in some sense a question of who's going to pay for a significant upgrade to the telecommunications infrastructure of the United States. Somebody's got to pay for it. And I think part of what's fueling and motivating this net neutrality fight is, I'm sure there's some greed involved, but I'm also sure that there is a legitimate question of who's going to pay for telecommunications infrastructure upgrades. Mm-hmm. The consumer, the company, the media, there's also a kind of realignment happening where for years, many of the providers of what we think of as internet service were cable companies who made most of their money basically selling you channels, HBO, ESPN, etc. And now that you can get that content online, then that's a significant lost revenue stream for them, and they're fighting to figure out how to protect it at the same time. So I'm definitely a very big supporter of net neutrality. I believe that I don't want any kind of bias, financial, ideological, or otherwise, in any direction in terms of how our infrastructure is used to deliver media. But by the same token, I also recognize there's some market forces at work, and there's also a significant question: who's going to pay for our infrastructure upgrade? Because we need it.
Our next question comes from Elizabeth from London, and it's very similar to one that we got from Takazawa Takedo from Tokyo, and it's about the future of cybersecurity, and then what role do you see cyber wars play, if any, in the coming years?
Cyber war, well, there's a challenging term. I think that I have a chapter on this in the book about the role of traditional military thinking, big armies and cyber war in the digital age. Because I'm not sure it's a useful way to think about and understand threat or security. If the question is what are threats to our safety, to our ways of life, if the concern is, how do we make sure that there's some degree of security online and offline, it's dangerous to think about the world in terms of cyber war, right? I think that my thesis is that technology pushes power to individuals. And so in the case of cyber war or cybersecurity, anyone who anybody with a $500 laptop and some significant technical skills is conceivably a threat